Welcome to the second part of the Organic Biochemistry set of podcasts. In this video, we are going to focus on acids, bases, and salts. Acids, bases, and salts are our next examples of the inorganic compounds. Acids, bases, and salts are easily identified based on what they do when you place them in water. So first up are the acids. Now, a common theme between acids, bases, and salts is dissociate. You see that right up here in the definition. Dissociate means to separate. So acids, bases, and salts, all three of these will separate into ions. An ion, again, is an atom with a charge. They'll all separate out when they're placed into water. So first up is an acid. An acid is a compound that will release hydrogens in solutions. Now here's what that means. When you put an acid in water, it will dissociate. It will separate out. And when it separates, you will have a hydrogen all by itself. So for example, if I draw like a little beaker of water right here, my little square represents a beaker of water. And a common acid that most students are familiar with is hydrochloric acid. So I'm going to write down HCl, hydrochloric acid. When I put hydrochloric acid in water, it will dissociate. That means the atoms will separate out, and I will have a hydrogen all by itself, and I will have a chlorine all by itself. Now notice that my hydrogen is a positively charged ion, which is referred to as a cation, and my chlorine is a negatively charged ion, which is called an anion. They keep those charges because that's how they're stable. Hydrogen is stable when it's positively charged. Chlorine is stable when it's negatively charged, and atoms will try to stay stable. So when you put that acid in water, it will dissociate, separate out, and you'll have hydrogens all by itself. That's your indicator that it's an acid. Next is a base. Now when you put a base in water, notice that definition says a compound that accepts hydrogen ions. That means when you put a base in water, it will also dissociate. However, the hydrogen will accept another atom will accept that hydrogen ion, and always it's going to be oxygen. Oxygen accepts that hydrogen ion, and oxygen and hydrogen together form hydroxyls. Hydroxyls are identified by OH. So when you put a base in water, you'll end up with OHs. Let me draw another little beaker of water here. A common base is sodium hydroxide, NaOH. That's called sodium hydroxide, where sodium is your Na, OH is your hydroxide. When we put this in water, it will dissociate. That's what acids, bases, and salts do. So when you put sodium hydroxide in water, it will dissociate. But instead of separating each individual atom, the oxygen will accept that hydrogen, and you will end up with sodium all by itself and hydroxide all by itself. The hydroxide will be negatively charged and the sodium will be positively charged. So putting a base in water, you release hydroxyl ions because that oxygen is going to accept the hydrogen. Now a salt is pretty easy to recognize because you're not going to have hydrogens or hydroxyls. Salts separate evenly. They dissociate evenly in the presence of water, but there's no hydrogens and there's no hydroxyls. So if I draw a third beaker of water here, and we have salt, NaCl, that's sodium chloride. When we put salt in water, it will dissociate, it'll dissolve, and you have sodium separating out from chlorine. Positively charged sodium because it's stable positive, chlorine stays negative because it's stable when it's negative, and they have separated, dissociated in water. But notice, I have no hydrogens and I have no hydroxyls. That is a salt. So put a salt in water, they'll separate, no hydrogens, no hydroxyls. When you put a base in water, Putting a base in water, again, they will dissociate, but your oxygen accepts your hydrogen, and you end up with hydroxyls by themselves. An acid, when you put an acid in water, they also will dissociate, but you will have hydrogen all by itself. It will release those hydrogens when it's placed in water. So here's some general rules to identify acids, bases, and salts. Keep in mind there's always going to be some exceptions to these rules, but these three rules really blanket the majority of your acids, bases, and salts. So in the previous slide you saw that when you put an acid in water, an acid is going to dissociate and you're going to have hydrogens. A base also will dissociate in water, but that oxygen will accept the hydrogen and you'll have hydroxyls. And salts are not going to have either one. Now, one thing I want you to understand, aside from just your basic definitions of what acids, bases, and salts are and what they do in water, I would like for you to be able to recognize compounds. If I give you a chemical formula, I would like you to be able to identify that as an acid, a base, or a salt. So here's the three rules that you follow. Acids are going to have H's all by themselves. Bases are going to have the OH's together, and salts are not going to have either one. So here's a few examples. If I write down H2SO4, MgOH, KCl, H2PO4. Okay, here's just a few formulas that you may see on test, and you may also see some different ones, but looking at these, I think you'll get the hang of it and figure out what to look for. So this first one up, H2SO4. Notice I have a hydrogen and I have an oxygen, but they are not together. The hydrogen is all by itself, so this would be an acid. MgOH. This is called magnesium hydroxide. Notice I've got an OH together, and anywhere you see an OH, it's going to be a base. So your hydrogen and your oxygen together, that's going to be a base. KCl. Notice KCl has neither one. There's no hydrogens, there's no hydroxyls. That one's going to be your salt. The last one here, H2PO4. Again, I do have an oxygen and I have a hydrogen, but they are not together. The hydrogen is all by itself here on the front. This is going to be an acid. So on your exam, you may have questions about definitions. What does an acid do when you put it in water? It releases hydrogens. What does a base do when you put it in water? It releases hydroxyls. What does a salt do when you put it in water? Well, it dissociates evenly into its atoms with no hydrogens and no hydroxyls. Also, if I give you some formulas, can you look at a formula and tell me if it's an acid, base, or a salt? Well, I hope so. At least now, after watching the video, you should be able to do that. H's by themselves, those are going to be acids. OH's together, those are going to be bases. Neither one, no H's and no OH's, that's going to be a salt. Now, one thing I do want you to understand, there are exceptions to the rules. There are some acids out there that don't have the OH together. That doesn't have the H by itself. There are some bases, there's some strong bases out there that don't have an OH. So there are a few, they're few and far between. But on the exams, I will not give you any of those exceptions. Anything that I ask will have and follow these three basic rules.